our speaker. That's Bill Morris. He is the director of the Fort Worth Aviation Museum. They have a mission of preserving and documenting and raising awareness about aviation history, not only in Fort Worth, but in North Texas. And so you'll want to take the opportunity, and I'm sure that Bill will invite you to come and visit the museum. He has researched a number of the recent historical markers they've done in relation to aviation history over the last couple of years, and is a second generation retired Air Force officer himself. So he is very familiar with aviation as a career as well as in history. So with that, he teaches aviation history classes at Tarrant County Community College. So I'm sure that he will bring lots of that information for you today. So Bill?
Thanks, Leanna. Since this is a kind of an educational opportunity, I think everybody ought to take out a sheet of paper and number 1 to 10. No, not really. This is a presentation. I've got about 140 slides in it. I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. Typically, we just addressed Fort Worth, but I wanted to expand it into North Texas this time, just because it offers some other unique insight into the aviation history around here. Of course, the first flight occurred in Fort Worth on January 12, 1911. It was at a place called the Fort Worth Driving Park. And he asked around and said, well, where's the driving park? And most people didn't even know there was a driving park. And we found it on an old flood control map for the Trinity River. This is 7th Street, and this is where the driving park was. A group called the Moisant International Aviators were traveling around the country. They started out in New York City in late 1910, and they would just go by train from town to town with their airplanes all disassembled, and anybody that paid the fee of $10,000 they'd put on an air show. And so Amon Carter heard that they were in Houston, so he sent a delegation down there. They came back and said, okay, we got an air show to do in Dallas, and then we'll come over to Fort Worth. So actually, Dallas had first flight 2 days before us, but you never hear about it. Anyway, the gentleman that actually flew the first airplane, it was a guy named Roland Garros. And any of you play tennis, you're familiar with Roland Garros Stadium in Paris, where the French Open is held. He was an avid tennis player. World War I, he became an ace. He was actually the first ace up until he flew a single place airplane. They really didn't have any machine guns on them. The machine gun was always the guy in the back seat swinging it around, shooting at other people. Well, he had a neat little trick. He put a steel plate on the back side of the propeller and shot through the propeller, spinning propeller, and any bullet that hit the propeller would just ricochet off. And he became an ace that way because none of the Germans were concerned, because he was just a single seat airplane. Anyway, Roland ended up being quite famous. That's a picture of the Blériot 11. This is a picture we found also. It was right after the Montgomery Ward building opened up, and in the background you can see the remnants of the driving park. I figured Roland took off somewhere between the front door of Ross Dress for Less and the Office Depot. 1911 was also another unique event. A gentleman named Cal Rogers left Sheepshead Bay, New York on September 17th, landed here on October 17th, and then went on to Pasadena, California, and landed there on November 5th, and he made the first transcontinental flight. Took him 69 stops, 22 of them were in Texas alone. He thought he'd never get out of Texas. He landed in a place called John Ryan's Pasture, which was just south of downtown. There was about, let me get this one next up. That's a picture of his departure. Spent 2 days here. On the 18th, he flew over to the state fairgrounds in Dallas and back. But he spent all his time here in Fort Worth. There was about 20,000 people on hand when he departed. And for those, you know, you're looking at a town that the population was about 50,000. So anytime you can get 40% of the population out to an event. Next major aviation event occurred in November of 1915. The war in Europe had been going on for 15 months, and the 1st Aero Squadron of the aviation section of the U.S. Army Signal Corps consisted of 6 airplanes. Fort Sill, Oklahoma. They were moving to a new field in San Antonio, and it was the first time they moved from station to station by flying. They landed in John Ryan's Pasture again. And there was about 3,000 people there when they came in. They had people in churches watching for them to come in from Wichita Falls, and they would ring the bells to let people know how close they were getting. Again, there was about 20,000 people who were on hand when they left 2 days later for Waco. That's a picture of the entire combat strength of the United States Air Force, November 20th, 1915. The gentleman third from the left is Captain Benjamin Floy. He was the commander of the squadron, later went on to do great things in Europe in World War II. There we go. And that's a picture of the squadron in John Ryan's Pasture. And for those of you that aren't aware of it, John Ryan's Pasture is now the Elizabeth Place neighborhood, just south of Elizabeth Avenue, or the Ryan Place neighborhood. Of course, the war in Europe had been going on since August of 1914. We entered the war in April of 1917. At that time, the Air Service had expanded to 5 squadrons, 2 here in the U.S. and 1 each in the Philippines, Hawaii, and the Canal Zone. So we were really not prepared to go play in that game over there. In May of 1917, there was a meeting between the Royal Flying Corps Canada and the aviation section of the Signal Corps, and the Canadians agreed to start training enough personnel to organize 10 squadrons. The training started in June in Canada, and in trade for that, the Army agreed to build them a training field here in the U.S. so they could train during the winter. Winters in Canada were not conducive to flying. City of Fort Worth offered 6 sites. They came in June to inspect them. The Canadians came down in July and looked at 7 sites in Texas and Louisiana. And in August, it was very rapid, the War Department signed leases on 3 sites around Fort Worth. And in September, the Canadians selected the 3 sites around Fort Worth. This is just a real quick overview. As I said, the Air Service was very unprepared for going to war. They established a series of a training program, the ground schools at 8 universities. One of them was the University of Texas. Graduates from the ground school then went to a place called Camp Dick, which was constructed on the site of the fairgrounds in Dallas. They built 14 primary pilot training fields. The ones in red are here in North Texas. We had Barren Field down near Everman, Carruthers and Benbrook. Lovefield was a late addition. First, the people of Dallas really didn't want a bunch of airplanes flying around and potentially crashing into their houses. Once the pilot was trained, they went to one of 3 disciplines, bombing, observation, or pursuit. Caulfield in Wichita Falls was for observation pilot and observer training. And then advanced training down here at the bottom, they had aerial gunnery. And the Tolivers Field, which is up Hicks Station north of Saginaw, was the first and largest of the 4 aerial gunnery training schools used by the Army in World War I. In November 1917, the Canadians came down here. They had 2 wings of 5 squadrons each and their School of Aerial Gunnery, and they took over all 3 fields. They continued to train Canadians for the Royal Flying Corps, as well as Americans for the U.S. Army Air Service, and also all the ground support personnel. The three fields were originally known as Tolliver Field 1, 2, and 3. They established what they call Camp Tolliver in downtown Fort Worth, originally in the basement of the Chamber of Commerce building, and then later moved to the Terrain building. And they had joint service control of the three fields. The Canadians took care of their personnel and procurement issues, supplies, spare parts, whatever. And then the Americans also took care of their side. When the Canadians left, they closed down Camp Tolliver, and each of the three fields operated independently by the Air Service. When the Canadians came down, they shipped in 254 Curtiss JN4s. When they went back to Canada, they left 180 of them here for us. Most of them pretty well banged up, but they were suitable for flying. Between November 1917 and April 1918, they logged 67,000 hours of flying, trained almost 2,000 pilots, and about 3,700, 4,200, I'm sorry, ground support personnel. And of the 10 squadrons that they started training in June in Canada, those 10 squadrons left Fort Worth between December 1917 and March 1918, and they were some of the first units, aviation units from the U.S. to go over to France. This is a picture of the Canadians arriving at Tolliver Field. I believe this is probably the one up by Hicks, based on the way the track is curved. And I've got a little comment to make. A lot of the pictures in this section that deal with the Royal Flying Corps, there was a gentleman named Sergeant Christopher Devos from Canada, and he apparently was an avid photographer and took probably 400 or 500 pictures that I've come across, and they're in the archives in De Toronto, Ontario. This is a picture of Barren Field down near Everman. All of the fields were identical. They were built to a standard set of blueprints, consisted of a row of hangars, main road through the field, and then all of the other buildings here were barracks, mess halls, schoolrooms, repair shops, quartermaster supply, things like that. Barren Field was a primary pilot training field. After the war, the Army used it to dispose of surplus property. You could get down there and buy a used Curtiss JN4 Jenny for about $100. They maintained the field as part of what they call the Army Airways system. It was a series of fields across the country that when pilots would fly, they'd have a place to land besides somebody's, farm or pasture, and so they had this essentially a regular system of flying across country from field to field. So put this picture in. It's number 80 Canadian Training Squadron, and here you notice it says Royal Air Force. On 1st of April 1918, they changed the name from Royal Flying Corps to Royal Air Force. So that's one of the first cadres of Royal Air Force personnel. This is a picture. The student pilot actually hit the ambulance when he was landing. One of the things in the training program was called accuracy in landing, and you never knew, if you're going to have to land in some field and a cow's going to run out. Well, all of the fields had a very massive field ambulance, and so some student would be coming in and they'd try to race out in front of him and make him hop over it. Well, this guy didn't quite make it over the ambulance. Can you find the pilot in the picture? Third one from the right, he's not looking at the camera. These are just a couple of pictures, basically what I call the work of aero repair. Airplanes are made out of wood and fabric, so if they crashed, generally they were be able to fix them up. And then the play area was the canteen in the Post Exchange. This is Carruthers Field in Benbrook. The road in the lower right corner is now Winscott Road, those of you that are familiar with Benbrook. And the road between the hangars and the buildings running east and west is now Cosby North Street in Benbrook. There's also another feature in here. These were 3 concrete silos. And if you drive down West Loop 820 and right when you merge with I-20 heading to the east, those are right in front of you. They still exist out there. This is a picture of Carruthers Field again. It's an aerial mosaic taken in 1918, overlaid on a 1952 aerial photograph. Again, Winscott Road is here. This is now 377. This showed the layout of the field, hangars, and then the buildings. And this indicates the railroad spur that connected it from the T&P Railroad into the field. This is one of Devos's pictures. He actually climbed up on the water tower apparently to take it. And that's Carruthers Field looking west. This, again, Cosby North Street now. And Mercedes is somewhere over in this area. Of course, the Canadians came down here to get away from this stuff. And in December and January was one of the most recorded snowfalls in Fort Worth. So they didn't fare too well as far as good flying weather. It's another Devos picture. It's a number 85 Canadian Training Squadron that apparently he took off, and I have another picture of this from the other side, and you can see it better. Took off between a couple of hangars, and the tail skid apparently caught the telephone wires, which immediately stopped him and pitched him right over into the barracks. This is another. Devo says, Cadet Townsy chops his way out of Texas. Ground looped it into some brush. This is a picture of the 379th Aero Squadron, which was stationed at Carruthers Field. They were actually part of the instruction team there, taught people how to fly. This is a nice picture Devos took too. The village of Benbrook, 1918. This is a picture of Tolivers Field looking north. The road over here in the lower left corner is now US 287 Business, just north of Saginaw. Tolliver was the first of 4 aero gunnery training schools. It was also the largest. It closed in 1919. It reopened in World War II. They still had some buildings out there. It was on the Hicks Ranch, and so there wasn't a whole lot of things going on except cattle wandering around. The building circled in red was the ammunition magazine, and I've got a little more on that in a bit. This is a School of Aerial Gunnery range map that showed the extent of the range. Again, Tolliver Field over here. The range extended from what was known as the Colorado Gulf Coast Highway, which is now US 287 Business, to the West Fork of the Trinity River, which is now at the bottom of Eagle Mountain Lake. Almost 12,000 acres. They had machine gun ground training ranges in here. They had a series of water-filled targets up here. There was an airplane silhouette target here, and then down in this area they had some trenches. And all of these were basically concrete lined, water filled, so when the pilots were come over and shoot at them, they could see if they were hitting the target by looking for water splashes. This was one of the ground trainers that they used. Actually put the pilot in there. The machine gun was fixed to the structure just like it would be in an airplane, and he basically had to fly that contraption to point the gun. It's a plane up here strafing at one of the floating targets that they had on the ponds out there. They also had floating targets on Lake Worth that they used to to strafe. This was a Curtiss Jenny that they painted up in German markings. It was the tow target airplane, and they would fly that all over that big 11,000 acre hunk of land, and people would do air-to-air gunnery on that. It's a picture of some of the aircraft for training. The second cockpit, of course, was modified with a machine gun in it, and Eastman Kodak came up with a nice little feature. They made what they called a camera gun, and it was just a long tube like a gun barrel, and behind it was a camera. And as the student was aiming at a target, he'd hit the button, the trigger, and it would take pictures. And then they'd come back and score where he was, because he would take a picture like of the airplane or the tow target. Tolivers also had the distinction of being probably the first place that they did aeromedical evacuation from. Planes would tend to go down occasionally on that 11,000 acre hunk of land, and there weren't a lot of roads in there. So they modified a Curtiss JN4, took the back of it off behind the cockpit and put in provisions for a stretcher. This is a picture of Lovefield in Dallas. Over here is Bachman Lake. Again, row of hangars separated by a road and some buildings. This is a picture that was in the Benbrook Library collection, and kind of had to figure out what it was, and it turns out it's Fort Worth aircraft, because one of them has a C on the tail, and that meant Carruthers. And down here, this is Lovefield in this area. And the other thing, although it's not really visible, Lovefield also had an aviation supply depot where they kept spare engines, spare parts, and things like that. And this is some more Fort Worth aircraft landing at Lovefield. Again, these ones still had their Canadian serial numbers on the tail. This is Call Field in Wichita Falls. It was located southwest of the downtown area. The road between the hangars and buildings was Caulfield Road today in Wichita Falls. So if you're up there and drive on that road, you're driving through the old airfield. This is where they did elementary training for observers and observation pilots. And this is Richfield in Waco. It was another primary pilot training field. The area is now occupied by the Heart of Texas Fairgrounds and Coliseum. And it was Waco's first municipal airport after the war, until they inherited a new airfield thanks to World War II, which is today's Waco Municipal Airport. A couple of interesting people that were here. This gentleman is Vernon Castle. He was born in England, came to the U.S., married Irene Foote. They did a dance team together, toured Europe. They did a lot of Broadway, vaudeville, early movies. Vernon and Irene were Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers before there was a Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. They were that famous. War started, he went back to England, became a pilot, did a tour in France, and then was posted to Canada, presumably to be closer to home because they lived in New York City. When the Canadians came down here, he was with number 84 Canadian Training Squadron, and he was killed in a crash on Carruthers Field in February 1918. That's a picture of, as Debo said, Captain Cassels' favorite bus. And the tail markings are the 84th Squadron. It was a red, white, and blue outline on the tail, and on his airplane, he had a rook that he painted on it. This is a picture Devos took. The building in the foreground was 6 married officer apartments. There was another set here and right behind it, and Castle lived in one of those 6 apartments. Don't know which one. The large building in the center was the officers club. Over on the right was the field hospital. Again, Cosby North Street. And this in the background here is Benbrook Cemetery, which still exists, by the way. So anyway, and this whole area right now where Castle lived and the officers club is now the playground at Benbrook Elementary School. So kids are playing all over a piece of history and they don't even know what took place there. This is a picture of Cassel. He titled it Major Sampson Checking the Timesheets. They logged the time of takeoff and landing for every student to make sure that nobody was getting too much time or not enough time. The interesting thing about this picture is all the cadets had white hat bands. That's how they distinguished them from, officers, since they weren't officers yet. When the Canadians and the Americans came down here in 1917, late 17, of course, it was a bunch of Army people at Camp Bowie going through training. And now all of a sudden, they're having to compete with pilots for the attention of the local girls. So the Army put out the story that if you had a white hat band, you had some sort of social disease. I guess that's how they tried to get even. This is a picture of Cassels' funeral in downtown Fort Worth. There's about 10,000 people out there. After the funeral, he went by train back to New York City. He's buried in New York City. Another interesting person, a guy named Ormer Locklear, was born in Greenville, grew up in Fort Worth, enlisted in the Air Service, trained at Barren Field, and then became a cross-country instructor. He found cross-country flying quite boring, so he ended up starting to do some sort of aerial stunts just to break the monotony. That led to a barnstorming career after he got out of the service, and then ultimately in the movies. He had made 2 movies. The second one, The Skywayman, he was killed in a crash, and Ormer is buried in Greenwood Memorial Park. This is how Ormer got over the boredom of cross-country flying. He crawled all over the airplane, here, hanging from the landing gear, and I think the next one's got some, yeah. These are some publicity shots that were shot over Los Angeles. And unlike wing walkers today that use the brace and the wires and everything to hold them on, he didn't use any of that. Doing a headstand, hanging by his feet from the lower wing, the typical wing walker pose, and then out on the landing skid. Early 1919, there were a couple of local people, R.L. Pearson and a guy named Casey Brayman. They bought a couple of surplus airplanes and they established the Fort Worth Aerial Transportation Company. It was the first commercial airline in the United States. Operated out of Rivercrest. Did not stick around very long. They couldn't get any more space. They wanted to get in at Barren Field, but they couldn't. And so they folded in 1921. That's a picture of Rivercrest. It was actually the polo grounds at the Rivercrest Country Club that was used by the commander of the U.S. Army Air Service training program here in World War I. That's where he kept his airplane, and then he could fly out to the 3 fields. Afterward, Fort Worth Aerial Transportation used it. This is a picture that was taken in 1930, so you can still see that they had some sort of markings for runways. And they had a row of hangars over here. When Charles Lindbergh came through Fort Worth after his flight to Paris and he did his national tour, he went to land at Meacham Field, and unfortunately the crowd rushed out onto the runway and he panicked and turned around, and so he actually landed here first and then at Meacham Field. This is Elizabeth Bessie Coleman. She was born in Atlanta, Texas in 1892. Family moved to Waxahachie, and that's where she grew up, went to school. 1915, she moved to Chicago to live with one of her brothers, and while up there, she got interested in flying. And nobody would teach her how to fly. So she went to a Berlitz language course and studied French, and went off to Paris in November of 1920. In June of 1921, Bessie Coleman became the first black woman to get an aviation pilot's license. She went back for some additional training. Did her first appearance in an air show in New York in 1922, and for the next 3.5 years she toured the country, basically as a barnstormer. She was killed while practicing for an air show in Jacksonville, Florida. She's buried in Chicago, and Bessie was inducted into the Texas Aviation Hall of Fame in 2000. 1880s, helium was discovered, and in the process of going through that, they also found that it was a naturally occurring element in natural gas. So whatever formed natural gas also made helium. They started searching around for oil fields and gas fields. The best one they found was in Petrolia, up in Clay County. During World War I, the Army and the Navy built an experimental extraction plant here in Fort Worth. And then after the war, they built a full-scale production plant here. And this is from a 1925 Fort Worth street map. The helium plant was located here. In 1923, they built a dirigible mooring station here. Up until this time, the airships operated on the East Coast out of Lakehurst, New Jersey. They expanded that to include Moffett Field in California. And when they made the cross-country flights, they needed a place to stop, and Fort Worth became the third U.S. Navy airship station. This is an inside of the plant. They actually piped the natural gas in from Clay County. It went through a cryogenic process. They just kept freezing it and drawing off all the other elements. And finally, the last thing to come out was the helium. And then they turned around and thawed out the natural gas and sent it off to Lone Star Gas Company. That's a rather crude picture, but it shows the helium tank cars that the Navy used to transport the helium from here to Lakehurst, New Jersey, and also to Moffett Field. This is a Navy Bureau of Yards and Docks drawing. Helium plant is located down here, and there was about a half a square mile area that was the dirigible mooring station. Just for reference, this road here is now Blue Mound Road, and this road here is now Meacham Boulevard, west of I-35. That's a picture of ZR-1 Shenandoah, Navy's first airship, departing Fort Worth in 1924. And this is not bushes at the bottom, these are people. The thing was about 760 feet long and about 70 feet in diameter. And that's a picture of ZR-3, the Los Angeles, departing Fort Worth in 1928. This particular picture was taken in the 2300 block of North Main Street. I assume by a gentleman named Mr. Miller, because here's Miller's photo studio over here. Anybody familiar with North Main Street and the giant wedgie-shaped bank building? That's what occupies this site now. I said Barren Field was closed in 1924. The Army terminated their lease. Fort Worth needed a new airport. The Army Reserve pilots that were training down at Barren Field leased a hunk of land north of downtown on Main Street and convinced the city to also take it over as the city's new airport. The land lease was approved by the City Council on July 3rd, 1925. So this July 3rd will be the 90th birthday of Meacham Field. That was the original building they built. Main Street ran right over here. By 1929, the airport had expanded to over 200 acres, and the city owned it outright. And today, Meacham Field is close to 900 acres, city-owned outright. Fort Worth was unique in that when the Kelly Act was passed in 1925, which got the Post Office Department out of the business of flying airmail and turning it over to small airlines, aviation concerns. Fort Worth was ideally situated to be the hub here in Texas and in the Southwest. Fort Worth was the home of the 11th Railway Mail District, so a lot of the mail that went by railroad came through here, got processed, and sent out on other trains. And ideally now, things come in by air, go out by train, come in by train, go out by air. Between 1926, when the first contract airmail route was established, Fort Worth, and by 1931, there were 34 of them in existence. 5 of them came through Fort Worth. National Air Transport flew from here to Chicago. You can see the rest. The CAM 22 originally went to San Antonio in 1927, and then in 1928 it was expanded to include Laredo, and then later that year also Brownsville and Corpus. And the Laredo and the Brownsville extensions covered international airmail into Mexico and Central and South America. And all of the mail that went to Mexico and Central America came through Fort Worth and then out to Laredo. One of the airlines that had some of the airmail contracts, this is Texas Air Transport here in Fort Worth. It was founded by Temple Bowen in 1927. Alva Barrett bought them out in 1928. And he ended up buying several other small airlines and operated as Southern Air Transport. Each of the airlines kept their same name, but the overall parent company was Southern Air Transport. Those airlines, along with 12 others in 1930, were bought out by a company called Aviation Corporation in New York City, and they were renamed American Airways. American Airways, the Southern Division, which was based around Southern Air Transport, operated out of here. Amon Carter convinced them to move the corporate headquarters from Dallas to Fort Worth. And in 1933, American Airlines built a hangar at Meacham Field. The building was dedicated in October of 1933, and a dedication plaque is to Amon Carter. It is the oldest building at Meacham Field. It still exists. This is a 1936 aerial view of Meacham. Unfortunately, it's not all that clear. Main Street used to run right here. This is the original hangar building they built in 1925. This is the American Airlines hangar. And this was the new terminal building they were constructing in 1936. And by then they had paved runways in, taxiways, and everything else. The one thing that I found interesting in this picture when I saw it was up here. That's the remnants of the dirigible mooring station. The center being the mast support, and the white areas around there were concrete anchor pilings that they used to secure the tail of the airship depending on which way the prevailing wind was, and that was a 600-foot radius, 1,200-foot diameter circle basically out there, and in 1936 it still existed. This is a picture taken in 1937, again the American Airlines hangar, and the new Meacham passenger terminal. It was the first air-conditioned passenger terminal in the country, and people used to just go out to the airport, watch airplanes, and sit inside in the summer. It got a lot of use. This is Hensley Field, which later became Naval Air Station Dallas. Dallas, when they finally bought the land of Lovefield, for Lovefield, in 1927, of course the Army had been flying their training missions out of there too, and they thought that that was going to interfere with their ability to get a lot of commercial business in. So they ended up going to far southwest Dallas and constructed and built this field, and then they leased it to the Army for $1 a year. And so all the Army guys, they moved down there, and that's where they did their pilot training, and Lovefield never saw them again. World War II comes along. The Army Air Force's training was basically a disjointed group of departments. They had pilot training, and then they had one for technical schools and for gunners and engine mechanics and you name it. They had them all under different departments. They consolidated all of that in early 1942 and moved their headquarters here to Fort Worth. And that was the headquarters building. Anybody recognize it? They had the top 4 floors of the T&P building. And they were there up till somewhere in 1946, and they eventually ended up at Randolph Field in San Antonio, where they are today. World War II came along, and of course there was a great need for some more training, just like in World War I. Here in North Texas alone, the Navy and the Air Force built 30 flying training fields. And this is just a list of them. Basically what they did, and if you go through and look at the right, what they are now, these things were built in towns that had no airport, or if they had an airport, it was a grass strip. It later became paved with buildings and hangars. And after the war, the Air Force and the Navy turned them all over to the cities or the counties. And so everybody got a brand new airport, basically, out of World War II. And this is just one list, and that's the rest of them. They did all kinds of training. It was basically basic pilot training. Hamilton Field was a glider pilot school. Bombardier training in Midland. Various things. And there was one down here in Terrell. And I got a little more on that. This is Fort Worth Army Airfield, 1943. The field was originally built to support delivering B-24s from the bomber plant, and it was just called Tarrant Airdrome. And the Air Force decided that, golly, we're building the airplanes here, let's teach people how to fly them here too. So they expanded the runways, built all of the complex on the east side of the field, and it was renamed Fort Worth Army Airfield, and it ended up supporting B-24 and B-32 crew training. This is a picture of Hicks Field. It was the Tolivers Field north of Saginaw in World War I. Air Force came in and built 3 of these, what they called, they were double arch steel hangars, and put in some more buildings and refurbished a lot of the old World War I stuff that was still on the site. And they did primary pilot training there. It was a contractor-run school. In the late 1940s, shortly after Lend-Lease was passed, Consolidated Aircraft had to get 250 PBY Catalinas to England. And this was the PBY-5, not the 5A with the landing gear. This was strictly a seaplane. Reuben Fleet, the head of Consolidated, is a very good friend of Amon's, and he called up and says, can you put a seaplane facility on Lake Worth? And in 8 days, city business leaders, civic leaders, and everything else had constructed Seaplane Base on Lake Worth. After the airplanes were delivered, the 250, the Navy continued to use the site up until about 1946, just to support cross-country flights of their seaplanes. That's a picture of Lake Worth with about 39 seaplanes on it. The seaplane facility was down in this area on the land, and that's Willow Island and Goat Island, and 820 crosses somewhere over in this area. Marines came to town and built an airfield up on Eagle Mountain Lake, and Eagle Mountain Lake Marine Corps Air Station. And they liked it because it was next to water. And the Marines had this idea of developing what they called an amphibious assault glider. The thing would carry 12 fully combat-ready Marines, and that included the pilot and the co-pilot. And the idea was to tow these things out to the islands in the Pacific and either land them on land or on the beach, but preferably in the surf. And then the surf would carry them in. Well, fortunately, they canceled the program before anybody got hurt. Because, you know, this thing lands and all of a sudden there's no waves. It's a piece of plywood sitting out there and everybody's shooting at it. And there's no place to go. So they canceled the program in 1943. And the Navy came in to Eagle Mountain Lake with another novel program. It was the TDR-1 Interstate, built by Interstate. It was an assault drone. It was a remote-controlled aircraft, carried up to about 1,000 pounds of weapons, and it was controlled by a modified TBF. Had a TV camera in the nose, and the operator in the TBF could see what the airplane was doing. He could actually use that to fly it and then dive it in on the target. They were used about 40 times in the Southwest Pacific with some great degree of success because they could fly in. They were very small, and they took out some pretty high value targets in New Guinea. But that was tested here at Eagle Mountain Lake. And of course, when they went off to the Pacific, the Marines came back and set up a night fighter aircrew training school at Eagle Mountain Lake. And that's the Grumman F3F two-seater with a radar operator in the back. And this is Eagle Mountain Lake Airfield right here. To support the training, both for the Amphibious Assault glider and the night fighter training, actually started it with the Amphibious Assault glider. The Marines also built an outlying landing field up near Rome. And it consisted of basically some barracks buildings, a hangar, concrete apron, big grass airstrip out in this area, where they were going to train the pilots how to fly that assault glider. Once that got canceled, the area went sort of dead, and when the Marines came back with their night fighter training, they used that as a radar site to track both the airplanes and the targets, and then they would tell the night fighter pilots where to go to get within their range of actually attacking the target. Navy also built a seaplane base on Eagle Mountain Lake. This one is adjacent to the airfield, and this one provided ramp access and a parking apron on shore, which Lake Worth did not have. Navy also had a facility at Meacham, the Navy Ferry Service, which flew airplanes that were manufactured in the East Coast to the West Coast and vice versa, cross country. Their route came through Fort Worth. Went from here to Memphis to Atlanta and then up the East Coast and then here west. And they had a ferry service unit here, 1942 to 1945. There was about 87 people in the unit that were stationed out there. And they didn't do a whole lot. It was just some Quonset hut barracks and a few other things. But the Quonsets, that's actually existed out in Meacham Field until about 1965. And then somebody thought they were an eyesore, and so they bulldozed them into oblivion. So there's no record of anything there. This is Hensley Field, 1941. By then, 1940, the Navy built a plant, an aircraft plant in Grand Prairie, and that's this facility here. And they tried to get one of their contractors, Grumman, Sikorsky, Vought, anybody that was building Navy airplanes, to come in and occupy it, and none of them would. So North American Aviation moved into town and operated out of that. They greatly expanded the runways to, again, take care of the flying training that was starting at Hensley, and also the aircraft deliveries. And in 1943, this was redesignated Dallas Naval Air Station. This is Dallas Naval Air Station's up here. This is map showing the 21 outlying landing fields that they used to support their pilot training program. And that's a list of the outlying landing fields and what they are today. Cedar Hill is now Cedar Hill High School. Collard is Wood Elementary School. Hanley is East Hanley Elementary School and some houses. Mansfield's Mansfield High School. So nice pieces of flat land became largely schools and shopping centers and housing areas. In the late 30s, Fort Worth started to look at ways to build a new airport. And they picked an area on the east side of town. They started doing some preliminary grading. The war came along. The Army Air Force Transport Command liked it. They came in, put in some runways and some buildings and basic structure to support flying operations. And then after the war they left, and then Fort Worth ended up with a partially completed new Fort Worth Airport. Little known piece of history. Mexico was neutral when the war started. And then after some German U-boats sank a couple of their oil tankers in the Gulf of Mexico, they declared war on them. But Mexico didn't do much except fly coastal patrols and try to spot submarines, both on the Gulf Coast side and the Pacific. And at some point, their president decided they wanted to do some more. So he recruited all volunteers, 38 pilots, and about 300 ground personnel, and they came to the United States for training. And they trained on the P-47, all the mechanics, the armorers, and everything did their training on it, and they completed their training at Major's Army Airfield in Greenville. Before they went to the Pacific, they flew just about 980 combat missions over the Philippines, the South China Sea, and all the way up to Formosa. And that is the only Mexican military unit to ever see combat outside of Mexico's borders. And they actually still fly today. Squadron 201 is stationed at Quintana Roo, Cozumel, and they fly maritime patrol out of Cozumel. Royal Air Force came back to Texas in early 1941. Of course, it's kind of difficult to conduct pilot training over England when you're being bombed every day. So they came to the United States. Franklin Roosevelt agreed to it. This is before we entered the war. So they came over and they were civilians. They didn't wear a uniform. They were taught by civilians, flight instructors. The first of 6 schools that they eventually had in the U.S. was in Terrell, and therefore it is the #1 British flying training school. They trained a little over 2,000 pilots for themselves and also for the U.S. Air Force during the war when they were here. Everybody takes the bomber plant for granted. It's been on our western horizon for ever since we can remember. When things started going bad in Europe, the War Department decided that they needed to expand aircraft production, and they sent survey teams out to look at places inland, away from the coast, because that's where all the aircraft manufacturing was essentially concentrated. Came up with a list of sites, sent them out to the aircraft manufacturers and said, pick one. And Reuben Fleet, again a very good friend of Amon Carter's, said he wanted Fort Worth, and they said Fort Worth is not on the list. And Amon went ballistic because they denied it. They could have said, no, you're going to Tulsa. So Amon and the Chamber of Commerce took matters in their own hands. And while the Chamber was talking to the congressional delegation and the War Department, Amon went to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and just says, I want to talk to Franklin. And Roosevelt, after hearing his argument, said, I can't tell the War Department to change, or can't change the War Department's decision, but I will give them 10 days to look at your objections and what you have to offer. And on January 3rd, the War Department announced that they were going to build a bomber plant in Fort Worth for consolidated aircraft. And then 3 days later, they sent an inspection team in to look for a site. That's a picture of Amon christening the first B-24 out. It was named the city of Fort Worth. And it's not champagne in the bottle, it's Lake Worth water in the bottle. This is a picture inside the plant. Between 1942 and 45, they produced almost 2,800 B-24s and another 300-ish of the cargo version of the B-24. This is one of the C-87s, cargo versions. This particular aircraft, 241-59, was named Guess Where 2, and it was the first airplane ever specifically designed for presidential use. So that is probably the original Air Force One, although Roosevelt never used it. It was designed to accommodate his wheelchair and had provisions for latching that down so he didn't have to mess with trying to get around in the airplane. He never used it, but Eleanor did. She had 2 tours to South America in it, and Averell Harriman did a couple of trips to Russia in it. That's the B-32 production line. Came in after the B-24s finished up. Built 114 of them. It was the last airplane to see aerial combat in World War II, and it was the last airplane to suffer an aerial combat casualty. They were flying recon over Japan 10 days after the war was over, and some enterprising Japanese fighter pilot decided to shoot it up. But he also got shot down too. But the plane made it back. But anyway, war ended, and the Air Force said we don't need them. And within a month of the end of the war, they were all headed for the scrapyard. Globe Aircraft Factory up in Saginaw. I'm going to have to press this up. They're going to run me out of here at noon. Globe Aircraft was founded by a couple of gentlemen, and their idea was to build a twin-engine airplane similar to the Beech AT-10. War started. They got a contract to build 600 AT-10s under license. They came in and upgraded the factory, and because it was basically an assembly building, all the parts for that airplane, as well as the forward fuselage that they built for the Curtiss C-46, were made in what is now Billy Bob's. It was an aircraft factory. Toward the end of the war, they also thought of getting back into the civilian business. They developed this 2-place Swift, all-metal airplane. Started building them, and they built about 830 of them before they shut down the production line in what was amounted to a hostile takeover, and they just pulled the plug and shut it all down. 1951, Amon Carter convinces Larry Bell to bring his helicopter operations here. Before they had their building in Hearst, they occupied the Globe Aircraft Factory site, and that's where they started building helicopters in Fort Worth. Parts for the helicopters were also manufactured in Billy Bob's. They continued to use the site up until about 1990. That's a picture of the Globe site in 1955. Factory area up here, runway. This is Blue Mound Road, and this is McElroy Boulevard, and North Loop 820 is somewhere down in here. As I said, North American Aviation occupied the plant in Grand Prairie, and during the war they built almost 13,000 AT-6 advanced trainers, about 5,000 P-51 Mustangs, or the photo recon version of the aircraft, and they also built 966 B-24 bombers over there. 1949, after North American left, the Navy finally convinced Chance Vought Aircraft to move to Grand Prairie, Texas, and they came down here with 27 million pounds of equipment and 1,300 families and set up shop in the factory, and one version of Chance Vought is still operating out of there today. Triumph Industries, Vought Aircraft Division or something. First nonstop flight around the world, Fort Worth to Fort Worth, 1949. The B-50 left Carswell February 26, 94 hours later it came back here, had 4 in-flight refuelings. Thanks to the Army Air Force's Transport Command doing some work at what they called Arlington Field or Midway Field. The city of Fort Worth came back in and said, okay, that's a great place to really have an airport. So they started constructing it. They tried to get Dallas to join in, and they initially did, to make it a regional airport. But once the plans were drawn up for the site, Dallas backed out because they found that the terminal building was 1 mile closer to the Fort Worth City Hall than the Dallas City Hall. So it became Fort Worth International Airport, and then they changed the name later to Greater Southwest International Airport, Amon Carter Field. This is a picture of the dedication. That's a picture of the field. Actually, it's a 1959 postcard, but it was quite modern for the time. This is a series of what I call pushing the envelope. Some of the oddities around here. In the 1950s, Convair modified 10 RB-36 recon bombers to also take the RF-84 recon fighter, and the idea was to use the bomber to ferry it over to close to the target, drop the fighter, let it scoot in, take pictures, and come back real quick like and hook up to the airplane and come home. Bell started out with what they call the XV-3 tilt rotor, and later developed into the V-15, and now it's today's V-22. This is the grandfather of the V-22. It was flight tested here at Globe and out at Hicks Field. Chance Vaught took one of their F-8U supersonic fighters, greatly modified it, put a larger engine in it. It was supposed to go up to about Mach 2.9, but they never got that high because the air friction overheated the canopy and it started to melt. So somewhere about Mach 2.5 is where they cut it off. Vaught, of course, later became part of Ling-Temco Vaught LTV, and instead of building a tilt rotor, they built a tilt wing, XC-142. They built 5 of these things. They were tested by all the services in NASA, but given that it was 4-engine and the cargo capacity wasn't all that much, that's as far as it got. Convair got in the act again. Martin built the RB-57E, which was a reconnaissance airplane, and by the time General Dynamics got finished with it, they made the RB-57F. Went from a 64-foot wingspan to something over 122 feet, 2 small engines to 2 very large engines, plus 2 extra engines that could be hung on the airplane. Had a service ceiling of over 80,000 feet, and that's the wing assembly fixture. 3 stories tall, and they're unloading one of the wings out of the fixture. Anyway, this kind of now for the rest of the story, and I'll make this quick because it's getting late. Answers to the questions. Bessie Coleman, Atlanta, Texas. #1 British Flying Training School, Terrell, Texas. Everything else is Fort Worth. Not that I'm partial. First Flight Park. Several years ago, we found a piece of property adjacent to the Montgomery Plaza complex that was owned by the city. It was listed in the Parks Department holdings, but they never did anything with it. And we finally got the city to designate it First Flight Park, and we've got a historical marker that was dedicated last year, and hopefully sometime next year that's what the park will look like once it's finished. There is a plaque in Ryan Place Park in the Ryan Place neighborhood to Cal Rogers and the Vin Fizz flight in 1911. When the Royal Flying Corps was here, they lost 39 members to various accidents and other things. 11 of them were buried in Greenwood Cemetery, along with an infant child, one of the instructors. In 1975, the last person buried there was an American from New York who was a pilot with the Royal Flying Corps down here, and he said he wanted to be buried with his buddies. So these people are buried in a part of Greenwood, and it's the Royal Flying Corps Cemetery part. And every 2 years there is a remembrance service. The next one will be held May 25th of this year. It's a piece of Fort Worth that will forever be England. Former Locklear is buried in Greenwood, has a state historical marker near his gravesite as well. This is the ammunition magazine at Barren Field. It's the last remaining building out there. It has a Texas state historical marker. There was a similar building at Carruthers Field in Benbrook, and it was bulldozed into Bolivian to make room for a Walmart supercenter. They do have a monument to Carruthers Field and to Vernon Castle. It's appropriately on Vernon Castle Avenue and Cosby West Street. This is a aerial photo of Tolivers Field. Shows mostly the range. This is the old field over here. The airplane target is in this area, and the trench system target was down here. This is the same picture. The building circled in red is the one that was in the 1918 photo, and that's a ground level view of it. It was their ammunition magazine, and it still exists out there, but it's not in the best of condition. That's the trench system target, or what's left of it. It was obliterated by housing development. All that remains is the scar in the ground, and that's the airplane target. It still exists. It was a full-size 40-foot wingspan, 32-foot long, concrete lined, water filled, and somewhere Bond's Ranch folks decided to fence it in to keep cattle from wandering into it. But it's not open to the public yet, but hopefully someday we'll have a park there. World War II hangars at Old Hicks Field. They still exist, but the place is really a dilapidated industrial site. Helium Plant, after it closed, the Airways Division of the Lighthouse Service moved in, and they set the early airport lighting standards, navigation lighting, cross-country flights at night, ended up doing all the early radio communication systems, and then later became the Southwest Region Office of the FAA. The Lake Worth Seaplane Facility is now occupied by the Lake Worth Boat and Ski Club and City of Fort Worth Marina Park. That's remnants of the Eagle Mountain facility. It still exists. If you get in a boat and go up on the northeast shore, you can pull right up to it. This is Oakland Memorial Park, a cemetery in Terrell. There are 22 members of the Royal Air Force that are buried over there from their pilot training days in World War II. And that is a piece of Terrell, which will forever be England. This is what's left of the Globe Aircraft Factory site up on Blue Mound Road and McElroy Boulevard. Water tower. It's Greater Southwest International Airport, Amon Carter Field, and when it was dedicated in 1953, the red dot is the control tower on top of the terminal building. That was it in 1968, after it had undergone its one and only expansion to get into the jet age. But somewhere in about 1964, the government decided that we don't need two big airports 30 miles apart. So Fort Worth and Dallas, you get together, and they came up with what is now, of course, Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. This is the site today. North-south runway was converted into Amon Carter Boulevard for the industrial area. This is now 360, 183, and the south entrance to DFW. And there is a portion of the north-south runway that still exists out there in the brush. Amon Carter, his legacy is woven throughout everything that involved aviation around here. First flight, the 3 flying fields in War I, the bomber plant, moving American Airlines Southern Division headquarters here, Bell Helicopter, you name it. I mean, his fingerprints were over everything. National Air Transport had the airmail contract from Chicago to here. 1926, 1927, 28, they started experimenting with also carrying passengers. They bought 8 of these Travel Air 5000s, carried up to 4 people plus the mail, and In February of 1931, they had them retired. They switched to Ford Trimotors, and when the first Ford Trimotor left Meacham Field for Chicago, they turned around and gave their first Travel Air to Amon. He took it to his place, Shady Oak Farm, and it sat outside for the next 30-something years. And in about 50 years ago, a guy named Harry Hansen was flying, saw it, got it from the Carter family, took it to Hamilton, and began a real slow restoration. We finished the restoration. The Fort Worth Museum was involved in this effort, but we didn't do it. But the restoration was finished last year, and the Travel Air is now on display downtown here in Fort Worth. It's in the old Star Telegram building press room, 6th and Taylor, and it's hanging from the ceiling, and as you drive by you can look in the window and see it. It's part of Bob Simpson's collection now. But all I cared was it get fixed and it come to Fort Worth. Yeah. Just a couple of quick slides to end this thing, looking at aviation progress around here. Consolidated aircraft went from the XB-24 to the supersonic XB-58 in just over 16 years. That's a blink of an eye in history. And Bell, in 35 years, went from the original XV-3 to today's V-22 Osprey. So, anyway, that kind of wraps things up. Does anybody have any questions? I know I talked a lot. The Fort Worth Aviation Museum is located on the south end of Meacham Field. We're at Ross and Long Avenue, about 4 blocks west of Main Street.
And your hours of operation?
Wednesday is like 9 to 4, Saturday is 9 to 5, and Sunday's 11 to 5. We have a website, Fort Worth Aviation, ftwaviation.com, and it lists all of the activities that we've got, and pictures of the airplanes we've got, and some of this stuff that is in here was, of course, displayed in the museum. But anyway, well, thank you.